Hello, I'm Sally Ann Baynard, Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and welcome to Luncheon, hosted here at the Rumi Forum in Washington. Today we are very fortunate to have as our guest Dr. Seyyed Hussein Nasr. He will be talking about insights from his new book on Islam, technology, and science. I hardly need to introduce him to anyone from the Washington area because we have been so lucky to have him in our midst now for a number of years at George Washington University. But for those who may not be aware, let me tell you that Dr. Nasr was born and educated his early years in Iran, went to finish his secondary education in the United States, and graduated in physics and mathematics with honors in 1954 from MIT. He then did a PhD in history of science and technology, and with a specialization in Islamic cosmology and science. In 1958, he received it from Harvard. He then taught in Iran, excuse me, in the United States, in Lebanon, and in 1979 emigrated to the United States permanently to become the first distinguished professor of Islamic studies at the University of Utah. He then moved to Temple University, and since 1984, we have been lucky to have him here in Washington as the University Professor of Islamic Studies at George Washington University. He is truly the foremost Sufi scholar of Sufism in America, and we are very lucky to have him with us today. Dr. Nasr.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I usually lecture standing up, but since they put these chairs down, I'll lecture sitting down. I do not want to insult you. It's the duty actually of a speaker to stand up and give his khutbah, as we say in Arabic. Let me begin with a little bit of autobiographical note. I usually do not like to speak about myself. This question in relation between Islam and science, and the most recent book of ours, I say ours because it was done in conversation with Muzaffar Iqbal, eminent Pakistani chemist who now lives in Canada and is devoted to the question of Islam and science, has a little bit to do with my own experience in life. As she just said, I began actually with the study of the sciences. I was very gifted in mathematics, and when I went to the Petty School in Hightstown, New Jersey, which is one of the best prep schools in this country, I received the highest grade anybody had ever received on the Princeton test in mathematics in this country, in the history of this test. So everybody thought I was going to be a very great scientist and so forth. And hubris of a young boy pushed me towards MIT, which was then the university, as it still is, of science and technology in this country. And I went there with great exuberance to try to study physics, which was the heart of modern science. And the first year, freshman year there, I was at the top of my class of about 90 people, all of whom were valedictorians from the best American universities, high schools, and some of them are very eminent physicists now. Some of them dropped out, some of them changed course. But it was in the middle of my studies at MIT that I soon discovered that what I was looking for was not what I was finding. There's a word in Greek called physikos. And they asked Parmenides, the great philosopher, is considered to be the founder of logic and the founder of Western philosophy, perhaps. What is your profession? He said, I'm a physicos. And you look at this, but it's like physicist. This might means that he was a physicist. Yes, but that was a physics which sought to understand the nature of things. And I soon discovered that physics is concerned with a mathematical structure to save the phenomena, as Ptolemy said. If I had nothing to do with the nature of things, if you ask a physicist, what is a neutron? Like you would ask a baker, what is whole wheat bread? The two answers would be completely different. As to what is a neutron would be certain mathematical formulae that you put on the board describing the valence and the various quantitative properties of this particle. Anyway, I don't want to get into details of physics now. That brought upon a major philosophical crisis for me. I was brought up in a family of very distinguished scholars. My father was Minister of Education of Iran. and I was given the best classical Persian education. I know half of Persian poetry, which is the Quran by heart at the age of 5. And so with that background, with this experience, I was put in a very difficult position. And you might say the rest of my life, since I was 20 years old, that is over half a century, has been spent in thinking about this question of the relationship between science and religion. I was by nature a religious person. God's mercy had always embraced me. I never lost faith, but at the same time I knew a lot about science. And it wasn't just from an engineering point of view. I'm essentially a philosopher. I had to think about the deeper things, about the question of causality, existence. What does science explain? Why does it explain it? Why doesn't it explain it? And I was repelled strongly by the positivism that dominated the philosophy of science at that time in this country, and it still does so, of course, to a large extent. Anyway, a number of experiences into which I will not go, meeting with incredible scholars, both here and in Europe, charted the course of my life, and I decided when I was in my 20s that I would try to study the Islamic science and try to open a new chapter in Islamic science, one which would be contemporary, at the same time deeply rooted in the Islamic tradition. And when I looked at what the thought that was going on at that time in this field, mostly coming out of Pakistan and India, which had just separated at that time, totally dominated by British education. There was nothing Islamic in it except the name of the authors who happened to had Muslim names. So at the young age of 24, I wrote my first book, which is Science and Civilization in Islam, which after 50 years is still taught in many universities, and unfortunately, very unfortunately, has not been replaced. It's terrible, a terrible comment upon the state of scholarship by Muslims themselves, that there should be many other books after that. But still, just recently, this book has been translated to Chinese. They just informed me a couple of months ago, which is very sad. But I started very early, and I did my PhD thesis at Harvard on Islamic cosmology, a book which was the first book in the European language on Islamic cosmology, published by the Harvard University Press. Both of these books were published by Harvard, which was my university. I was a professor there, studied there, and so forth. And those books are still in print, unfortunately. And again, the book on cosmology, if you're trying to find a book on Islamic cosmology, after 50 years, 55 years now, you still have to go to that book. In any case, my career was involved for decades with this question, and at the beginning my voice was a very jarring voice in the Islamic world. What do I mean by jarring voice? Since the 19th century, and this brings me up to the content of this book, since the 19th century, when certain Muslim leaders, intellectual leaders, began to think as to why the Islamic world had become weak. Why is it that, according to the Quran, وَإِنْ يَنْصُرَكُمُ اللَّهُ فَلَا غَالِبَ لَكُمْ, if God helps you, no one overcomes you? Why have you become taken over by the British on one side, the French on the other side, the Russians in Central Asia, the Dutch in Southeast Asia, and so forth and so on? This question arose, and different answers were given. Is it the crisis in us? Is it that God has forsaken us? Is it that Islam was good for the 7th century but no longer good for the 19th century? At that time, of course, the 19th century was taken very seriously, as we take the 21st century very seriously. And it's no more serious than the 19th century. We sort of idolize the age in which we live as if we have the final form of knowledge, which is one of the great absurdities of the world in which we live. This is a modern idea. It did not exist in traditional societies. Anyway, these people, some of them just were oblivious to the rise of Western science and technology, who brought modern science to China. Without Ricci and the early Jesuits, there would have been no Mao Zedong, and 50 million Chinese would not have been massacred in the Cultural Revolution. But this China is not the subject of our discussion today. Coming back to the Islamic world itself, everywhere you looked, there was this thrust of Western education, which the governments, even in the three countries that remain independent in the Islamic world, Ottoman Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. These are the only three countries that were independent countries at that time. The rest were all colonies, directly and indirectly. But even in those three countries, the governments were in favor of opening the door because they had heard that Western medicine is more efficacious than Islamic medicine, which is not necessarily the case in many fields. It is in some fields, it's not in other fields. If you get a pain in your knee, you get lumbago, Chinese medicine is much more effective than Western medicine. And you take Advil all the time until you die. And we all have undergone that experience. But we throw away the medical tradition, very rich medical tradition of Islam as a result of the pressure of the governments. Except for India, there were too many people there, so the British could not bring Western medicine, and both Ayurvedic and Islamic medicine have survived in the subcontinent. The only place where Islamic medicine is alive today is in Pakistan and in Muslim India, that is the Delhi Sant Hamdard Institute in Delhi, and if you Hyderabad and a few other places. Anyway, not to get into details, this awareness brought about the fact that some of the ulama now paid attention, and some of them became very, very pro-Western science, and some of them didn't say anything about it, some of them became against. But a very great tragedy occurred at that time for which we paid very dearly, and still paying very dearly. Namely, practically none of the ulama studied Western science seriously. So whether they became its great champions or its opponents, in both cases, Western science ceased to have any significance in the traditional thinking in the Islamic world, or it became a new religion for some people. And let me turn to the second category. A large number of people appeared that first of all began to write so-called scientific commentaries upon the Quran. It was called a Tafsir al-Ilmi in Arabic. And the first work appeared in Arabic in the hands of an Egyptian doctor, physician, and scientist called Al-Iskandarani, man from Alexandria. Big commentary, many, many volumes. That's, I'm sure it exists in the Library of Congress. It exists at the Harvard Library. I don't know whether it exists here or not, but it's interesting to consult it once. Because now you read this is so absurd. Because all the science that he said at that time derived from the Quran is now abrogated. Which means that the Quran is abrogated, astaghfirullah. But this kind of thing was the beginning of a trend in which people thought that they were serving the Islamic world by equating the Quranic understanding of ilm with modern science and finding roots of actual theories and discoveries of modern science in the Quran. Now, this was a temptation so great few could resist, because you would have your cake and eat it too. You would have worldly power, Islam would become powerful, castigated by my family who almost disowned me because I went to study philosophy and history of science, and so what is all this nonsense? And the funniest thing that when I decided to go to MIT, I received a very, very nasty letter from one of my cousins who was then minister in the Iranian government. So you ruined the name of your father, of the Nasr family, of centuries of great scholars. What is this MIT? Why don't you go to New York University or Columbia, something like that? Nobody even knew where MIT was. And I had to open up the door to that. And during these 50 years that have passed, I've had perhaps a unique experience of all people living today of being immersed in this discussion, teaching at Tehran University for 20 years, lecturing all over the world, participating as the founder with three other people of the first World Congress of Islamic Education in Mecca, held in 1977, in which I gave the talk on behalf of all non-Saudis. It was not easy to give a talk in Arabic in the city of my ancestor, the Prophet, but for someone who's a Persian. But I did it, alhamdulillah. And I helped found several institutions, and I was several years the president, the chancellor of the most important University of Science and Technology in the Islamic world. was then called the American University, and the Sharif University, State University of such level that Stanford just announced any student applying to Stanford from Sharif will get in without any examination. These are the people who have enriched uranium, who made all these missiles, who can do almost anything. I mean, they're geniuses, these young kids. And when I was a professor at Tehran University, Iran's mother university, when I went there, I was amazed at the level of mathematical and scientific knowledge and interest. And it's the one university which has kept on the same level. All the other universities came down in quality because so many professors left after the revolution. It's the one university that remained on the same level. And at that time, when I became president of this university, the first week I had a sort of extra power and all the budget that I wanted. The Shah had given me to do whatever you like. To create a Persian MIT, that was his order to me, that is MIT, which is also Persian. I said, to be Persian, you have to have the Persian humanities and Islamic thought and Islamic philosophy. Just can't train out engineers. So I started this program with great opposition. As anyone would, in these sort of positivistic universities, what are you doing teaching Hafiz and Sadi and Ibn Sina? How is this relevant to training a physicist or a mechanical engineer? But at that time, I wielded extraordinary power in the educational scene in Iran. I could do anything, absolutely anything. And I did it. I received a letter a month ago, after this book that I'm signing came out, from the dean of the physics department, Dr. Golshani, who's still there. He said, Dr. Nasr, after 30 years, your wish has been realized. We just started the PhD program in the philosophy of science based on Islamic philosophy of science. I gave a lecture at the university at that time that we have to study Western science. We have no choice, but we have to resuscitate our own philosophy of science. And I wrote so many books to this end. This book has already come out in Iran. Within 1 month, they brought it out in Iran. It's now coming out in Turkish. I just was in Istanbul. They're bringing it out in Turkish very soon. Turkey is a very important country because the thought of Bediüzzaman Nursi and Fethullah Gülen and others who have spoken so much on the relationship between science and religion. It's good to sort of shake the mix a little bit, as you say in colloquial English. I'm not opposed to studying Western science. I've studied it myself. I'm opposed to accepting the presumptions and hypotheses upon which Western science is based as being absolute. One of these events in which I was participating was held in Pakistan, and that's what led to this book. At that time, Leghari was the president of Pakistan. During the 20 years when I was professor at Tehran University and vice chancellor, dean, and later on president of American University, Iran and Pakistan being neighbors, I used to visit Pakistan almost 4 or 5 times a year. I counted, I'd visited Pakistan 19 times during that 20-year period, which was a lot. And a lot of contact. My uncle was the first Iran ambassador to Pakistan. People like Muhammad Ali Jinnah used to come and stay in our family house in Tehran. There was a lot of personal relationship also. And I loved Pakistan. It was a country, it was a second country to me. And I had given many, many lectures there. And about 20 of my books have been reprinted in Pakistan in English by the Sohail Academy. And my writings are as well known there as any country except Iran and Turkey, perhaps. Or almost equal. Anyway, the Pakistanis decided to have a major conference on Islam and science in the 21st century to be inaugurated by the President of the Republic, Mr. President Leghari. And they were very kind. They chose me to give the keynote talk on the first day before the President, that I would talk and then the President would speak and inaugurate the conference. I didn't really want to go all this way, but I did. I went all the way to Lahore and Islamabad, and anyway, the session was held. It was there that I met this Pakistani scholar I'd never met before, called Muzaffar Iqbal, who was in charge from the Pakistani side of organizing this conference. He was a chemist, studied in Germany, very fine chemist, who was also very much into Islamic studies and Islamic science, and he had read right through the errors that the Muslims had been making for a whole century by just playing with the word ilm and science and science and Wissenschaft and so forth, and not really doing any serious science, but glorifying themselves like this by just talking about it. He had read right through this. And he was very angry at the policies of the Pakistani government concerning this matter. Well, he was hoping that there would be a change of pace in this whole affair by inviting me. He had read my writings, and he was very much on the side of what I had said. And so I gave a talk, which was in a sense a historical talk, because it changed so many things, on the relationship of Islam and science. The President of Pakistan got so angry at my talk that in front of everybody he took the text I had prepared for him to speak, tore it up, and he said, I have to speak about something else. We respect so-and-so, but we do not at all accept his ideas. Science is the future of Islam. We have to do this. You know, the usual shebang that you hear from all Muslim leaders from left and right. And that caused Muzaffar Iqbal to resign. He left Pakistan permanently. He left Pakistan and came to Canada and became a very important voice through the publication of the journal Islam and Science, which is by far the most important journal coming out right now, dealing with this issue. And he kept in close contact with me, and he's made many suggestions to me, one of which led to this book. Now, if I had 20 fountain pens and could write 10 articles a day, I could not exhaust the requests that are made upon my time from all over to write this, write this, write this, write this. And I'm hoping, inshallah, to break all my pens, throw them away, and as soon as the new translation of the Quran comes out, not write anything the rest of my life. But it's not going to happen. I think on my deathbed, I'll have to be writing for somebody. And so he was one of the people who kept requesting for me to write this and that, and I had a lot of respect for him, because he, along with Suhail Umar and Muhammad Ajmal, a few Pakistani scientists and scholars, were a small nucleus who really understood what was involved. When in 1958 I came back to Iran, and at the age of 25 as a Harvard PhD and 3 years of teaching experience at Harvard, there was not a single voice in the Islamic world that accepted to hear what I had to say. Not one person. And had it not been for the inferiority complex which most Muslims have toward the West, the fact that here comes a person who's graduated from the most important universities and knows many Western languages and so on and so on, his books are published by Harvard, I would have been completely crushed from the very beginning. But God will otherwise, and did not happen. And gradually, step by step, we established the whole school, which now exists throughout the Islamic world with very eminent people, from Osman Bakr in Malaysia to Haddad Adel, who recently became the head of the parliament in Iran, Arabs, Turks, Ibrahim Khalin, who's a Turk, all over the place, people who understand this perspective and who are trying to create an authentic Islamic science by creating, first of all, a space through the critique of a purely materialistic and a horizontal science. Not that it's false on its own level, but it's false when it claims totality. That is to try to destroy the totalitarianism of modern science. This is now becoming more and more of a possibility. And as a result of this, finally I told, what's his name? Muzaffar Iqbal, that, all right, I don't have time to write what you want me to do. He wanted me to write a kind of more simple book, not these sort of high-flung philosophical and scholarly works that I've written before with a lot of footnotes and references and things like that. That you have to do, because in the Western academia, if you don't do that, they don't listen to what you're writing. They don't look at the depth of the text. They look at the number of footnotes. And that's the world with which you're dealing. If you have a few German and Greek footnotes and so, you're considered to be a very important scholar, even if you say nonsense in the text itself. But to write something simpler, I'd originally accepted 20 years ago to write a text called Towards the Philosophy of Islamic Science, and I never wrote it. I did in 3-4 chapters. Other things came along and I put it aside. And I told you I don't think I'll ever finish that, but I'm willing to do a series of conversations with you. And he is so much aware of the major issues involved. He's written 2 very good books called Islamic Science and Science and Islam, both ways. And from 1995, he spent all of his time studying Islamic science. And the present book that I'm going to sign for you in a few moments is the result of those conversations, plus something which he wrote on that famous conference in Pakistan and the Lagari event and his own interest in this field, and a chapter I'd written as the first chapter of this book on the philosophy of Islamic science on why it is that the cosmos is a worthy subject of study, the world, from the point of view of Islam and the Quran, which constitutes the first chapter of this book, and then his introduction. And the rest of it are really the main part, the heart of the book, is a series of conversation, extensive conversations, on subjects which were chosen by him. The question of origins, the question of biology and human life, and so forth. And you will see it in the book. I have tried not to write too much about biology because I'm not a biologist. I know a lot more about physics, but also I have an advanced degree in geology from Harvard. I've studied paleontology for a long time, and I've been a very severe critic of evolutionary theory, not as a fundamentalist, but from a scientific and philosophical and logical point of view. Harun Yahya, this Turkish writer who is now very popular, discovered my writings. He was trying to meet me in Istanbul. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to see him, and he sent me this big book, Atlas of Life, and a beautifully illustrated book. There's a big movement afoot in Turkey right now, more than any other Islamic country, to provide a response to Darwin. It's very interesting. As I said, the most secularized of all Islamic countries also this is afoot. In Pakistan and India and those places are hopeless because Spencer is still being taught in colleges. Nobody knows in the philosophy department here at her university, my university, who Spencer was anymore. I mean the students. But he was a evolutionary philosopher of the early 20th century who tried to philosophize, who created a whole philosophical system on the basis of Darwinian evolution. Nobody reads him anymore. But in the subcontinent, that's still being taught to students. And so the greatest defenders of evolutionary theory have come from the subcontinent of India and the Islamic world. Very, very serious defenders of Darwinian evolution will come from the Arab world, Iran, or the Turkish world. There are a few, of course, but the most of them have come, people like Mateen, others have come from the subcontinent. But on the insistence of Muzaffar Iqbal, because of the significance of this question, because if you take Darwinism seriously, there's no choice but being either an atheist or a hypocrite. Some people choose hypocrisy, some people choose atheism. But what do I mean by hypocrite? That is to believe in God, at the same time believe it has nothing to do with life forms on earth. That's a kind of hypocrisy, because if one is a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or a Buddhist or a Hindu, it's not just an abstract deistic God, it's a God who acts as his own creation. And this idea is absurd from a Darwinian point of view. Of course, there's a whole army now of Christian theologians who are trying to give a theological Christian interpretation of Darwinism. The most famous, of course, being Teilhard de Chardin, who founded a whole new school in Catholicism, and perhaps the first person in the Islamic world to give a response to him. But when you look at it, it calls Christ the omega point of history, and everything evolves towards the omega point, which is Christ. And he forgot that Christ said, I'm the Alpha and the Omega. So I once gave a lecture in Paris. I said, everything that's in Omega must already be contained in Alpha, if you believe the word of Christ. But this kind of distortion, and that's why I call it hypocrisy, intellectual hypocrisy or lack of clarity, one of these two things. In any case, he induced me to also include something on that, although I had written very serious philosophical discourses before on what Darwinism really means philosophically. And the book came out with the title Islam, Science, Muslims and Technology, because I also deal in this book more clearly than anywhere else with my critique of modern technology, which was dispersed through many of my writings before. I never wrote on technology per se. When I was at MIT, whenever we went to the lab part of, let's say, electromagnetic theory in physics, God would force me to fall asleep, and I had to keep my eyes open in the laboratory not to fall asleep. So I knew that this kind of modern technology was not for me. But I had to study it, of course, as a philosopher, a scholar, and the critiques of it by people like Ivan Illich and others. What happened, of course, with the environmental crisis, which is directly related to that, which I've been involved for decades. That is not too much included in this work. Anyway, this is a kind of summary of how this work came about and the serious ideas that are involved. It involves ideas which are as important as anything in the present context in the world, the Islamic world and elsewhere. If the Islamic world succeeds in becoming like Japan in science and technology, the Western world will be finished. It will be eclipsed completely. Let's pay attention to this political reality. Nobody wants to talk in these terms. And if it does not succeed, there's no certainty that the Western world itself is not going to collapse from the environmental crisis and the rest of us with it, with all that is happening. So in either way, there is a very serious crisis afoot, both for the Islamic world and for the West. And what leaders of Islamic thought will think today and tomorrow about the relationship between Islam and science, about how we study Western science, will determine to a large extent the future, of course, of all Islamic countries. For the moment, even the rich Islamic countries are really just eating the breadcrumbs of the tablecloth of Western meals. Not even the food itself, just the breadcrumbs. And in most Islamic countries, things have not changed that much. The Islamic country which is the most wealthy and had the greatest amount of transmission and transfer of Western technology into it is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has not produced any creative scientists yet. Engineers, a lot of engineers, a lot of doctors, and so forth and so on. But at the creative edge, and that's there that the future of the relation between Islam and science will be decided. Let me conclude with something, because this book, along with my other writings, are attacked all the time by a large number of people who think that I'm threatening their position as holders of knowledge, of legitimate knowledge. I don't mean in the West, in the Islamic world itself. And they always accuse me that I'm against the studying Western science. This is totally false. One day when I'm no longer here, and you will hear that so-and-so says so-and-so, you should hear it from my own mouth. I'm not opposed to studying Western science. I've studied it myself. I'm opposed to accepting the presumptions and hypotheses upon which Western science is based as being absolute, and therefore not to be able to go beyond it. As Newton and Galileo went one step, I don't say in progress, even further away from, beyond, let's say 16th century physics. But they had studied it. The early treatise of Galileo, the 1610 treatise of Galileo, is based on really medieval and Renaissance science. And then comes the discourse and the dialogue, and Galileo moves toward the creation of this new physics on the basis of a new philosophy of nature, a new set of hypotheses concerning the nature of reality. And it's this which I believe that Muslims can do, provided they stop this inferiority complex, provided that they re-understand their own intellectual tradition, be able to create their own philosophy of science. And once that is done, it will be at that frontier. Next step in quantum mechanics, in biochemistry, in genetics, and so forth and so on, in astronomy, that steps can be taken to create an authentically Islamic science. And all the debates we carry out now are related to that, and the simple submission to Western science and technology is a form of cultural colonialism. That is, the other aspect of the culture cannot be totally separated. If everything that appears in the West is just simply emulated by us blindly, then when you're doing tawaf around the Kaaba, you hear cell phones ringing, which is exactly what you hear right now when you visit Mecca, the house of God, and 1,000 other things. It changes the whole tempo of our life. How one deals with one's mother. Once you have email, your relationship with your relatives changes, and sometimes not for the best, because you don't want to answer your cousin immediately, and you're forced to do so by the fact that you have an email and she expects your answer in 5 minutes. I'm just joking, of course, but in many, many different ways, this is something that is unavoidable. Its significance is unavoidable not to recognize. One can reject what people like myself say, but that you cannot reject the questions that people like me bring forth. You might want to provide your own answers, different from mine or others, but you cannot avoid the questions. Without that, the Islamic world is not really living intellectually. It's just sleepwalking. And that's not enough for a great civilization. Many Muslims say, why don't you have a Christian science? Because in the West, which was predominantly Christian, science became secularized.
Now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience in just a moment.
My question is about the conflict between two Muslim major countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Any comments about this?
Yes. First of all, my criticism of the Iranian government is no more than the criticism of any other government. Saudi government, Tunisian government, Indonesian government, and so forth. But the reason I mentioned Iran was because it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. Because when I was president of American University in charge of this atomic center that the Russians had now taken over in Bushehr, and I was against its building, but I could not exercise my decision. I used to fly with a helicopter there all the time. That people who were in favor of the Islamic Republic of Iran, one of the great attacks they made against me was why it is that I was helping to build that atomic plant, because that was against the interests of Russia at that time. And Brezhnev was sitting in Moscow. It's different from the Russia of today. It was the Soviet Union. Then came the revolution, and they stopped that reactor, or it wasn't even built. Anyway, the construction. So, well, alhamdulillah, thank God for that. 5 years later, when Rafsanjani, several years later, became president, they started it again with a loss of $2 billion to the Iranian people, according to Mr. Rafsanjani's own estimate. And it's still going on. That's why I gave the example of Iran. I would have been the happiest person in the world. A lot of my ideas were implemented during the Iran Revolution. Not all of them. I did not have the same political vision.
Sorry to interrupt you. Why shouldn't Iran have an atomic bomb? Pakistan has it.
I agree. I agree. I agree.
I mean, why shouldn't Iran?
I agree 100% with you. Yep. I am against nuclear arms altogether, but that's another argument. But through the whole spectrum of Iranian society, both within Iran and in the exile community, except a few stooges, but the rest of them, anyone who has a national feeling, a patriotic feeling, they all believe exactly what you said. You cannot have a little country of 6 million people having 300 nuclear warheads sitting at the edge of the Mediterranean. I'm referring to Israel. And then have Iran, or for that matter, Turkey or Egypt. What kind of excuse is that? If Iran has it, then Turkey and Egypt will want to have it. And not have it. militarize the whole of the Middle East. As far as nuclear arms are concerned, and I'm sure Iran would be very, very happy to be part of it. There's no doubt. As for the leadership of the Islamic world, leadership does not come only from democracy. Democracy has become a slogan. America, I'm sure, is very much opposed to democracy in Egypt. If democracy will come to Egypt, the Gaza would not have been destroyed like that. Obviously, because the people of Egypt would not have allowed it. So this is just a game. I said jokingly, sometimes when I get angry, I said the English language is a language in which sounds and letters do not always correspond to each other. For example, you say enough, you write GH, and you make the sound fa or F. And there's a word written in English which you write out as hypocrisy, but you pronounce as democracy. But what Iran is doing now, which is more important than these, is that without doubt, Iran, along with Turkey, these two countries, have the intellectual leadership of the Islamic world right now. Turkey, of course, is moving more and more in this direction. For a long time, Turkey didn't want to have the intellectual leadership. They didn't want anything to do with the Islamic world. The intellectuals were really French intellectuals who spoke Turkish. They were not really Muslim intellectuals. There were some. But it's moving in that direction. And Iran has always been a great center of Islamic intellectual life throughout history. That's where the Avicennas and Khayyams and Birunis and Khwarazmis and all of those people came from. And the Islamic intellectual tradition is very much alive. And I think that's the most important reason, more important than